You're nothing here anymore. Get out of this house, or tomorrow your precious apple trees will be reduced to splinters." She was left entirely alone against her ruthless, powerful stepsons. Driven by pure greed, they are ready to destroy not just her century-old apple orchard, but the memory of their own father. Just as the law seemed to side with these traitors, the widow decides to search her late husband's abandoned study. What she discovered, hidden on the dustiest shelf inside an ancient book, will change the entire legal battle and make these corrupt men tremble. Morning light crept through the wavy, historic window glass, casting distorted amber patterns across the faded Persian rug. My bare soles met the wide pine floorboards. They groaned with a deep, hollow resonance, a familiar, creaking complaint of this old house. The hallway air carried a heavy mixture of beeswax polish, dried lavender, and a subtle dampness rising from the deep stone cellar below. Walking past the oval portrait of my late husband, my thin fingers brushed the carved, dark oak frame. They collected a microscopic veil of gray dust. I stood before the tall window with its uneven, historical glass. Outside, the morning mist hung thick and heavy over the ancient apple orchard, the limbs of the Gravenstein trees sagging under the weight of the ripe, dew-slicked fruit. This house, these trees, these fragile remnants anchored my existence to a world Thomas had departed. I draped a heavy, forest-green wool shawl around my shoulders, breathing in its comforting scent of dried sage and old wood smoke. My sturdy leather boots sank into the damp grass as I stepped into the early quiet of the orchard. I walked slowly through the neat rows of apple trees, my hands sliding along the gnarled, rough bark of a mature tree. The ancient wood was dry and retained a faint warmth from the previous day's autumn sun. Bending down, my fingers closed around a fallen Gravenstein apple. Cold dew coated its smooth, red-streaked skin, and its sharp, vinous aroma instantly brought a vivid memory of Thomas gathering them in large wicker baskets for our autumn pies. Suddenly, a harsh, metallic screech shattered the quiet air. Flocks of startled crows erupted from the upper canopy, their wings beating a frantic rhythm against the rising fog. The damp ground beneath my soles began to vibrate. A convoy of heavy construction vehicles rumbled to a halt near our low boundary fence, their progress leaving deep, muddy ruts in the gravel. The massive yellow excavators and flatbed trucks idled with a deafening, rhythmic roar. The sweet aroma of damp earth and ripe apples was instantly choked by a wave of hot, greasy diesel exhaust. Thick clouds of gray road dust rose from the enormous tires, settling on the delicate apple leaves like ash. The massive steel buckets of the diggers caught the pale morning light, shining with a cold, predatory glint. My hands began to tremble. I squeezed the cold Gravenstein apple in my palm, using the sharp physical pressure against my skin to steady my nerves. My stepsons had crossed a line. This was no longer a legal threat delivered through white envelopes. It was an active invasion of my sanctuary. The metal cab door of the lead flatbed truck swung open with a loud groan. A heavy-set foreman in a soiled orange safety vest climbed down, holding a cheap plastic clipboard. He marched directly toward me, his heavy, steel-toed boots ripping through the damp clover. He smelled of stale tobacco and lukewarm, burnt coffee. Without speaking a word of greeting, he thrust a paper document toward my chest. The sheet was cold and rough against my skin, smelling strongly of fresh, chemical printer toner. My eyes scanned the bold text. Notice of site preparation and land clearing, bearing the sharp, aggressive signatures of Oliver and Carter. The foreman grunted, explaining his crew had strict instructions to uproot the first row of trees before noon. Indignation, cold and sharp, rose within me, pushing away the initial fear. The foreman barked a sharp order to start the machinery. The primary tractor began to crawl forward, its metal tracks grinding against the loose gravel with an ear-splitting screech. Without considering the physical danger, my legs carried me forward. I placed myself directly in front of the giant steel scoop. The intense heat from the radiator hit my face like a physical wave, carrying a wind saturated with hot engine oil and grease. I pressed my bare palms against the cold, rusted steel of the track, welcoming the dirt and oil on my skin. I stood completely motionless, staring through the dusty windshield at the operator. The massive machine halted inches from my coat. Angry shouts rose from the workers, but I remained still, my legs anchored to the soil as if I shared roots with these very trees. A sleek, black SUV pulled up onto the gravel lane, its tires kicking up a fresh wave of dust. Oliver stepped out of the vehicle. His tailored navy wool coat was immaculate, though his polished leather shoes immediately gathered a layer of fine dirt and dead leaves. He marched directly toward me, his eyes cold and devoid of human warmth. He grabbed my elbow, his fingers pinching my skin through the thick wool of my shawl. I resisted his pull, wrapping my fingers around a greasy, rusted bolt on the excavator track to anchor myself. Carter watched from the passenger window of the SUV, a thin, superior sneer on his lips. I stared directly into Oliver's cold eyes, stating clearly they possessed no court eviction order to touch these trees. Oliver released my arm with a sharp jerk, his jaw tightening in anger. He turned, demanding Carter produce our legal authority. Carter got out of the vehicle, clutching a thick stack of fresh paperwork. Standing my ground, I pointed out a critical omission in their filing: the mandatory county environmental permit required for altering land containing historic agricultural growth. I recalled this specific environmental code from my reading of Thomas's old property records. Carter checked his tablet, his eyes widening slightly before he murmured a quiet admission of their oversight. Oliver's face darkened with rage. He ordered the foreman to halt the work until tomorrow, promising to return with the sheriff. The engines died, and the SUV sped away, leaving a cloud of exhaust. A blessed silence returned to the valley. I walked toward the house, my boots dragging heavily on the gravel path. The thick oak front door shut with a solid, echoing thud, sealing out the mechanical violence of the outside world. I entered Thomas's private study, a room untouched since his passing, representing a quiet capsule of his working life. The space greeted me with its familiar, comforting scent of aged leather, cherry pipe tobacco, and dried ink. The floorboards groaned softly beneath my weight as I crossed the room. I approached his massive mahogany desk, where a thin layer of gray dust coated the polished wood, reflecting the amber light of the setting sun. I ran my hand over the cracked green leather inlay, recalling his presence. The heavy leather chair creaked loudly as I sat in its worn embrace, the leather cold against my thighs. I reached for the top drawer of the desk, the wood swollen from the coastal humidity, resisting my pull. I tugged harder with both hands, releasing a small puff of fine paper dust, causing me to cough. Inside lay old utility receipts, expired warranties, and tarnished steel pens. I searched through the papers, inhaling the dry aroma of decaying cellulose. My fingertips turned gray as I worked. I searched for any record of his final financial decisions, but found only empty manila folders. Oliver and Carter had cleared out his files after the funeral, but their arrogant haste often left blind spots. I ran my fingers along the empty metal hangers where files once hung, realizing they had missed the physical drawers themselves. My attention shifted to the towering bookshelves lining the dark oak wall. I stood up, my joints stiff from the morning cold, and reached for a rare 1890 edition of John Keats's poems in a worn, brown calfskin binding. The cover was dry and cracked, smelling of old animal hide and ancient bone glue. The thick, watermarked pages turned with a dry, papery whisper under my fingers. On the flyleaf, Thomas's elegant, flowing handwriting remained intact. To my dear Marion, my anchor. As I held the volume, the rear board proved unusually thick and rigid compared to the front. I pressed my thumb firmly against the green silk lining of the board, discovering a small, rectangular cavity hidden beneath the fabric. It was a classic bookbinder's trick, a secret hiding place Thomas had constructed years ago. My fingers traced a faint seam in the green silk lining of the reverse board. The old adhesive had turned to a fine yellow powder which fell onto my wool skirt. With a gentle, deliberate pull, the silk parted with a soft tear. Inside the hidden cavity lay a cold, heavy metallic object and a sheet of folded parchment paper. I reached inside, pulling out a solid brass key engraved with the logo of the long-defunct Cascade Heritage Bank, its surface tarnished with a dull green patina. Beside it lay a small paper ledger, its pages fragile and smelling of deep storage. My heart hammered against my ribs as I laid them on the desk. This key was not a standard house key. It was a safe deposit key, designed to guard secrets deep within a vault. I unfolded the parchment paper with extreme care, avoiding any tearing of the fragile creases. It was Thomas's private financial log from 15 years ago, written in his precise, hand-inked script. I brushed away a speck of ash from the entries. The final line showed a transfer of $3 million to an anonymous escrow trust, executed the day after he finalized the sale of his beloved vintage car collection. The brass key in my palm belonged to a safe deposit box at Cascade Heritage. I realized I held the key to the secret my stepsons wanted to bury, the hidden transaction explaining their sudden wealth and their desperate attempt to drive me from this land. I sat in the dimming light of the study, clutching the brass key, ready to begin my search. The morning post arrived with a sharp tap against the glass pane. A courier stood in the mist, handing over a heavy linen envelope. Inside lay the official injunction, a cold piece of parchment signed by the county clerk, freezing my entire financial existence. This was Oliver and Carter's work, a clinical strike disguised as a legal precaution. Later, at the local market, my plastic card proved useless, rejected by the terminal with an indifferent beep. I returned to the house, opening Thomas's walnut dresser to retrieve his old calfskin wallet. The worn leather carried the scent of sweet peppermint lozenges and aged hide. I spread the court order on the table. The paper emitted a harsh, chemical stench of fresh ink, contrasting with the dusty warmth of the room. My stepsons were constructing a financial cage, attempting to starve me out of my own home, cutting off every avenue of support before we even entered the courtroom. Midnight brought the violence. A sudden sharp crash shattered the silence of the front parlor. A heavy river stone had torn through the historic glass of the porch, sending a cascade of sharp shards across the pine floorboards. I awoke with a start, my skin cold under the blankets. Rising from the squeaking brass bed, the chill Oregon wind rushed through the house, carrying a cloud of dry rose petals from a delicate porcelain vase on the sideboard. Outside in the darkness, coarse, unfamiliar voices rumbled, accompanied by the splintering crack of our old wooden fence. Oliver's hired men were tearing down the perimeter. No police would reach this remote valley in time. The duty of protecting this historic sanctuary fell solely upon my shoulders, my fingers tightening in the dark as I realized the depths of their cruelty. I navigated the dark corridor by memory, my fingers tracing the smooth, familiar groove of the oak paneling. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned in protest. Entering the kitchen, I reached toward the brick hearth, wrapping my hand around a heavy, antique fireplace poker. The forged iron was freezing to the touch, smelling of old soot, coal ash, and rusted iron. I gripped the ribbed handle, the weight reassuring in my trembling hands. Stepping out onto the damaged porch, I observed two dark silhouettes in the shadow of the broken railing, their crowbars raised against the remaining pillars. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, rhythmic pulse. I took a deep, silent breath, preparing to defend our sanctuary, letting the cold iron of the poker become an extension of my resolve. I would not allow them to strip away the physical memories Thomas had left behind. I advanced in complete silence. Stepping onto the dew-slicked deck, I swung the iron poker with every ounce of my remaining strength, striking the metal crowbar of the nearest intruder. A ringing clang echoed through the night, throwing bright blue sparks into the dark. The man shrieked, dropping his tool onto the hollow wood. I raised the heavy iron again, my silhouette framed by the cold autumn moon. Terrified by the unexpected fury of an old woman, the vandals retreated, scrambling through the orchard and leaving behind the sour smell of cheap whiskey and trampled grass. I stood shivering, leaning on the poker. My palms were black with soot and rust, but the immediate threat had ended. I had held the line, my heart pounding in the quiet night as the fog rolled over the broken fence. At dawn, I drove to the city, arriving at the sleek, glass-fronted bank, which had absorbed Cascade Heritage years ago. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a blast of climate-controlled, synthetic air. I squeezed the brass key in my coat pocket, the green patina smooth against my thumb. The sterile scent of commercial carpet and toner was foreign, a stark contrast to my lavender-scented parlor. I approached the reception counter, demanding a meeting with the branch manager. I placed the heavy, tarnished brass key on the polished quartz desk. The teller stared at the antique metal, her face blank, unable to comprehend its place in her digital world. It was a relic of an era when keys were forged of brass, not encoded on plastic strips. She handled it gingerly, as if it were a bone from an ancient excavation. The branch manager, a young man in a stiff gray suit smelling of lavender cologne, handled the brass key with obvious reluctance. He spent 20 minutes tapping on his computer keyboard, his eyes scanning ancient digitized records. His voice was polite but entirely devoid of hope. The archives of Cascade Heritage from 15 years ago had suffered water damage during a river flood, and the surviving paper files had been shipped to a secure, closed facility in another state. My chest tightened. He returned the key, its ancient metal, now carrying a smudge of his modern oil. The clock was ticking. The trial was tomorrow, and my key led only to a distant, inaccessible warehouse. The legal walls were closing in, leaving me with a useless artifact and no time to request the files. I returned to the quiet house, sitting at Thomas's mahogany desk. The soft groan of the floorboards recalled his old stories about his private workshop, a small brick structure situated at the rear of the family car dealership. Oliver and Carter had padlock secured the main showrooms, but they remained unaware of Thomas's hidden habits. He had always kept his most private files away from his greedy sons. My fingers traced the cold rim of his bronze inkwell, still smelling of dry iron. I resolved to enter the workshop under the cover of night. I packed a heavy canvas bag with a brass flashlight and Thomas's old steel tools, which carried the rich scent of grease and machine oil. This was my last chance to unearth the truth before tomorrow's judgment, a desperate gamble in the dark. Rain fell in steady, cold sheets as I reached the dark perimeter of the dealership at midnight. The modern glass showrooms stood empty, the sleek hoods of the new inventory reflecting the distant street lamps. I squeezed through a ragged tear in the rusted chain-link fence, the wet pine branches scratching my wool coat. The air smelled of wet asphalt, pine needles, and stale gasoline. I crept toward the old brick annex at the rear, where Thomas had first built his business. My boots crunched too loudly on the wet gravel. I turned on the flashlight, its narrow beam illuminating the heavy wooden door of the workshop, bound by a thick iron chain and a heavy padlock. The old bricks were dark with moisture, weeping under the heavy Oregon downpour, holding the silence of 20 years of abandonment. I reached into my bag and retrieved a heavy iron crowbar, its ash wood handle smooth from decades of Thomas's grip. I wedged the rusted claw beneath the padlock's clasp. I threw my weight against the iron bar, my boots slipping slightly on the wet concrete. The old oak doorframe groaned and splintered, releasing a small shower of dry wood-borer dust and the smell of ancient decay. My shoulder muscles burned with the effort, my breath shallow and rapid. Finally, with a loud metallic snap, the clasp broke and the heavy chain clattered to the concrete. The door swung open on screeching hinges. I stepped across the threshold, my light cutting through thick clouds of white dust dancing in the cold air, revealing the forgotten interior of his private world, untouched. and silent. The workshop was a tomb of forgotten mechanics. Heavy cobwebs hung from the rafters like gray lace, brushing against my cheeks. The air was thick, suffocating, smelling of old kerosene, grease, and the prelay leather seats of long-sold cars. My boots left deep, distinct prints in the gray dust covering the floor. I ran my fingers over the dusty instrument panel of an old engine, my skin turning black with sticky grease. Thomas's presence lingered here, in the neat rows of wrenches and the old calendar on the wall. This place had been his sanctuary, his escape from the endless demands and cold ambition of his sons. I observed the tools, each placed with meticulous care, representing a life of quiet defiance against their greed. Here, Thomas was not a weak father. He was a master of his craft. The light of my flashlight swept across the wall above the workbench, resting on a soot-covered oil portrait of Thomas standing beside his first truck. The wooden frame was thick with grime, leaving black marks on my palms. I pushed the heavy picture aside. Behind it, built directly into the brickwork, lay a small cast-iron safe. I retrieved the brass key, my fingers trembling as I inserted it into the keyhole. The old lock turned with a heavy, dry, metallic click, the gears grinding with a stiff reluctance. The iron door opened with a screech, releasing a draft of cold, damp air and the unmistakable smell of decaying paper. Inside lay a single, tied document, preserved in the dark for decades, waiting for someone to uncover its hidden truth. I reached inside, my fingers closing around the paper. I pulled the paper from the dark safe. It was the original car collection bill of sale, its parchment yellowed and fragile, the edges crumbling like dried leaves. I turned the page over, my heart stopping as I scanned the reverse. In Thomas's heavy, ink-penned handwriting lay a passage from King Lear, detailing the venomous bite of an ungrateful child. The document confirmed the transaction. $3 million paid by an offshore entity, yet the true identity of the buyer remained obscured behind layers of legal terminology. I clutched the fragile sheet to my chest, inhaling the scent of dust and ink. I possessed the evidence of their transaction, yet the final mask of my stepson's ancient betrayal remained intact, a mystery I had to solve before the sun rose on the courtroom tomorrow morning. I spent the early morning hours at Thomas's mahogany desk, relying on my decades of academic training as a researcher. My task required analyzing the faint, stamped impressions and watermarks on the reverse of the car bill of sale. The quiet study smelled of drying wood and ancient ink. Beneath my chair, the floorboards groaned softly with every shift of my weight. Using my father's heavy brass magnifying glass, I deciphered a smudged notary stamp in the lower corner of the document. The faded purple ink revealed the name of Arthur Pendleton, a prominent estate attorney who had passed away years ago. A subsequent search through old directory records yielded a crucial connection. Pendleton's personal legal archives had been transferred to his former junior associate, Harold Vance, a retired federal prosecutor residing in a secluded historic home on the outskirts of the city. I drove through the heavy Oregon fog to meet Harold Vance at his sprawling Victorian estate. The house projected an aura of fading grandeur, its massive columns weathered by decades of coastal rain. Inside the grand foyer, the air carried the scent of polished rosewood, damp plaster, and heavy wool carpets. Vance, a tall, silver-haired gentleman with sharp, piercing eyes, received me in his high-ceilinged personal library. Towering oak bookshelves, packed with leather-bound volumes of Supreme Court reports, lined the walls. The floorboards emitted a deep, rhythmic creak under Vance's heavy steps as he crossed the room. I sat in a stiff, high-backed Victorian armchair, my fingers tracing the rough upholstery, which smelled of old dust and horsehair. I placed Thomas's bill of sale on the table between us, waiting for his reaction to the faded signatures of my late husband. Harold Vance studied the bill of sale through his old, horn-rimmed spectacles, his liver-spotted fingers tracing the fragile edges of the sheet with extreme care. He let out a long, heavy sigh, admitting he remembered the transaction. He recalled Thomas visiting his office 20 years ago in a state of absolute despair, begging to establish an anonymous escrow account under a strict seal of confidentiality. Vance rose and walked toward a massive steel filing cabinet in the corner. The metal was painted a dull gray, its surface marred by small patches of rust. Vance inserted a small key, turning it with a dry, metallic click. He retrieved a heavy cardboard archive box from the lower drawer, releasing a thick cloud of gray dust, forcing me to cover my mouth with my hand. The scent of ancient, decaying paper filled the small library. From the depths of the cardboard box, the former prosecutor extracted a thick envelope made of coarse, yellowed paper. It was bound tightly with a piece of decayed hemp twine. The red rosin wax seal of Pendleton's old firm was heavily cracked, but remained intact, smelling of old pine sap. Vance gently blew a layer of gray dust from the surface and handed the envelope to me. He warned me the envelope contained the single surviving copy of Thomas's private file. I took the packet, the rough texture of the paper grating against my fingertips, which were stained with ink. A small, cautious spark of hope flared in my chest, a temporary relief from the impending doom of tomorrow's trial. I thanked the old attorney for his help and returned to my car, eager to examine the contents in the safety of my study. Upon returning to my estate, I parked the car and immediately observed Oliver waiting on the front porch. He stood, leaning against the damp, unpainted wooden railing, which smelled of wet pine and green moss. Oliver wore an expensive cashmere overcoat, and the air around him carried the heavy scent of his wood and leather cologne. His cold, calculating gaze fell on the canvas bag I held, where the legal envelope was concealed. He stepped forward to block my path to the front door, his heavy, polished leather shoes squeaking loudly against the wet cedar planks of the porch. Without a word of greeting, he extended a packet of fresh documents, the paper emitting the sharp, chemical odor of modern printer toner. The stark white sheets rustled in the cold breeze, a silent threat. Oliver offered a settlement, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He demanded I sign a voluntary transfer of the house and the orchard in exchange for a modest monthly stipend. He sneered, declaring my lawyer would be easily crushed in court tomorrow, and the ancient trees would be cleared by bulldozers anyway. I stared at my stepson, a deep, heavy disgust rising within my chest. I stepped away from him, my fingers tightening on the canvas bag. Oliver reached out, his hand wrapping around my wrist, squeezing the bone through the thick wool of my coat. I wrenched my arm from his grip, stating clearly that I would never betray the memory of his father. He smirked, tossed the papers onto the wet porch, and returned to his vehicle, leaving the white sheets to scatter in the damp grass. The encounter left me shaken. I decided to drive my old station wagon to the city to deliver the files to my attorney. The engine started with a raspy, uneven roar, and the interior smelled of gasoline, prelay vinyl, and decaying maple leaves. I navigated the vehicle onto the winding highway, which was heavily shrouded in the dense Oregon mist. Suddenly, the glaring headlights of a massive, dark pickup truck appeared in my rearview mirror. The vehicle pursued me aggressively, filling my cabin with a blinding, white halogen glare. My fingers gripped the cracked plastic steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. The truck tailgated my car, swerving from side to side, in a deliberate attempt to force me off the narrow road, the engine roaring behind me. The dark truck accelerated, slamming hard into my rear bumper. A violent metal-on-metal screech echoed through the misty air as my taillight shattered. I struggled to maintain control of the sliding station wagon, my shoulder hitting the driver's door with a dull thud. The interior filled with the pungent odor of burning rubber and electrical sparks from the broken wiring. The pursuer moved alongside my car, preparing for a second strike, to send me into the deep, rocky ditch. Realizing my danger, I spotted a familiar dirt track leading to the rear entrance of my orchard. I yanked the wheel, plunging the vehicle off the main road and into the misty rows of trees, praying the ancient orchard would protect me. The old station wagon bounced violently over the deep ruts of the orchard path. Heavy apple branches scraped against the windows, tearing the remaining yellow leaves and dropping ripe fruit onto the hood with a sequence of dull thuds. The wide pickup truck, too large for the narrow rows of trees, struck a thick oak trunk, the impact tearing off its front bumper. The driver put the vehicle in reverse, retreating into the fog with a squeal of tires, defeated by the very trees they sought to destroy. I parked my damaged car near the house, my hands trembling with shock, my palms stained gray from the dirty steering wheel. I grabbed my canvas bag and ran inside, bolting the heavy front door against the night. I secured the deadbolts on the front door, my breathing shallow and rapid in the quiet hall. I retreated to Thomas's study and lit his old brass kerosene lamp. A warm, amber glow filled the room, carrying the rich scent of kerosene and charred wick. I sat at the mahogany desk, my fingers soiled with road grime and rust. I placed the envelope from Vance's office on the blotter. With a steady hand, I pried up the cracked, red rosin wax seal. It broke with a dry, snapping sound, scattering tiny red shards across the desk. I pulled a stack of folded parchment sheets from the envelope, the paper emitting a strong smell of old ink and cellar dampness. My hands shook as I smoothed the pages. I spread the yellowed pages of the 20-year-old agreement across the desk. The legal text detailed the complex securities fraud committed by Oliver and Carter during their first year as law partners. It was an absolute record of their guilt, outlining the misappropriation of client funds. However, when I turned to the final page, my heart stopped. The sheet meant to contain their signatures and formal confession had been violently torn away. Only a jagged, fibrous white edge remained, covered in a fine layer of old paper dust. Without those signatures, the document was merely a collection of unverified allegations, useless in a court of law. Someone had deliberately mutilated the file, destroying the only proof of their crime. I sat in the dimming light of the study, staring blankly at the mutilated document on the desk. The direct evidence of their crime was gone. Outside, a heavy downpour began, the rain drumming against the window panes, while the autumn wind made the old house creak and groan. Tomorrow morning, I would have to stand before the judge with nothing but circumstantial files, which their high-priced lawyers would easily dismiss as fabrications. The hope of saving my home and the orchard died in my chest. I pressed my dirty palms against my face, inhaling the smell of old paper, cold rain, and the burning kerosene lamp, completely trapped in their legal snare, with no exit in sight. The final battle took place within the austere, wood-paneled walls of the historic county courthouse. I sat at the heavy oak defense table, the oppressive gravity of the state's judicial machinery pressing down on my shoulders. The high-ceilinged room harbored a sharp, familiar scent of old floor wax, decaying legal files, and the damp wool of the spectators' heavy coats. Beneath the shifting weight of the anxious onlookers, the long wooden benches emitted a sequence of slow, agonizing groans. Across the carpeted aisle, Oliver and Carter sat flanked by an imposing phalanx of senior corporate litigators. Their bespoke navy suits and unyielding, predatory posture projected absolute certainty. I kept my eyes lowered, my trembling fingers tracing the rough, woven texture of my wool skirt. I sat defenseless before a cold, mechanical apparatus designed to strip away my home. Oliver's lead attorney strode toward the bench, his voice echoing through the chamber with practiced, booming authority. He spoke of manipulation, depicting me as a predatory interloper who had systematically isolated a fading patriarch in his final, vulnerable years. Oliver maintained an attitude of solemn grief, occasionally pressing a linen handkerchief to his eyes. The lawyer held up medical charts, presenting a selective, distorted narrative of Thomas's decline. A low, condemning murmur rippled through the spectators behind me. My own attorney sat beside me, helplessly shuffling a stack of minor character references, his posture signaling defeat. I reached into the pocket of my tweed jacket, my fingers closing around a heavy, cold, silver object, Thomas's pocket watch, my remaining connection to his quiet soul. I traced its cold metallic edges under the fabric. I withdrew the silver watch, letting its cold weight rest in my palm. The tarnished casing was covered in hundreds of tiny, delicate scratches, the physical record of Thomas's working days. A faint scent of fine watch oil and old silver rose from the metal. In that dark moment, as the prosecutor's voice rose to a crescendo, Thomas's voice echoed in my memory. The truth lies deep within the heart of time, Marion. Seek it at the center. I studied the dial under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the courtroom. My thumb traced the outer rim with deliberate focus. Near the junction where the winding stem met the rear plate, I detected a microscopic, unpolished gap in the silver casing, an irregularity I had never observed before, a hidden seam. Acting on instinct, I removed a steel hairpin from my bun. Concealing my movements beneath the edge of the oak table, I gently pressed the blunt end of the pin into the tiny gap. A sharp, metallic click echoed softly against my palm. The solid rear plate of the watch separated into two thin discs, revealing a hidden, hollow compartment Thomas had secretly engineered within the silver casing. A subtle aroma of dried lavender and aged parchment escaped from the tiny chamber, preserved for decades. Inside lay a tightly rolled cylinder of translucent paper, held in place by a microscopic silver clamp. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized Thomas had preserved the missing piece of our salvation within his own pocket watch, keeping it close to his chest. I carefully extracted the tiny scroll from its silver cradle. The paper was incredibly thin, almost weightless, smelling of old beeswax and dry ink. With trembling fingers, I unrolled the sheet on my lap. My eyes watered as I deciphered the tight, elegant script. It was the missing final page of the 20-year-old settlement agreement. At the bottom of the page lay the unmistakable signatures of Oliver and Carter, signed in faded blue ink under a notary's embossed stamp. Beside their names lay Thomas's personal seal, pressed firmly into a disc of blue rosin wax. This was the absolute, undeniable proof of their fraud and their waiver of his estate. I held the document, my breath catching at my late husband's genius, realizing he had foreseen this final confrontation. I stood up from the defense table, my knees stiff. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned with a loud, sharp creak, drawing the attention of the entire room. Ignoring my attorney's frantic gesture, I walked toward the judge's bench. My movements were slow and deliberate. I placed the fragile, translucent parchment and Thomas's silver pocket watch directly onto the polished wood before him. Oliver's face paled, and Carter shifted uncomfortably, his confident smirk vanishing in an instant. The judge, a stern man with white hair and dark robes, adjusted his glasses and picked up the paper. He examined the raised texture of the signatures, his thumb brushing the embossed notary seal with a look of growing interest, scanning the faded blue ink. A silent silence settled over the courtroom, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic ticking of Thomas's watch on the desk. The judge read the document twice, his eyes narrowing. He observed Oliver and Carter, his expression hardening into cold disapproval. He read aloud the specific clause detailing the automatic transfer of the fraud files to the Department of Justice in the event of a dispute. Oliver's face drained of color, his skin turning a sickly gray. Carter reached for his tie, loosening the knot with shaking fingers. Their elaborate corporate trap had collapsed under the weight of this single, fragile sheet of paper. They realized their careers and their freedom were hanging by a thread, exposed by their late father. The judge summoned the attorneys to his bench. Oliver was forced to approach, his feet dragging across the carpet, his head lowered. His hands shook as he stared at his old signature. The old ink seemed to scream his guilt from the paper, smelling of old iron and dust. The judge spoke in a low, metallic whisper, informing Oliver of the impending referral to federal authorities if they persisted. Oliver's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently to his client. He explained continuing the lawsuit meant certain ruin. Oliver stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of cold fury and desperate terror. He realized he had lost, his empire of lies dismantled by a ghost from his past. Carter hurried to join his brother, his face pale as paper. He whispered they must sign any agreement to bury this scandal. Under the judge's cold gaze, Oliver's attorney announced the immediate withdrawal of every claim against me. The clerk quickly drafted a formal settlement, a complete waiver of their rights to Thomas's estate. Oliver took the pen, his fingers leaving wet smudges on the crisp white paper. He signed his name, his status as a powerful attorney dissolving with every stroke of the pen. Carter signed after him, pressing the pencil so hard the lead snapped with a sharp click. Their conspiracy had ended in absolute defeat, their greed turned to ashes. The judge declared the case dismissed, returning the documents to me. I folded the fragile signature page and slipped it into the secret compartment of the silver watch, the metal warming in my palm. Oliver and Carter left the courtroom through the side door, refusing to face the waiting reporters. They were ruined, broken by the quiet foresight of the father they had despised. I watched them depart, my heart empty of triumph, filled only with a deep, cleansing peace. My attorney shook my hand, but I merely smiled and thanked him. This victory had been won, without screams or drama, solely through the enduring power of Thomas's quiet love, hidden within his watch, guarding our home. I returned to my Oregon estate as the afternoon sun began to slide behind the hills. The heavy oak front door opened with a familiar creaking groan, welcoming me home. The air inside smelled of beeswax, lavender, and sweet apples. Outside, the heavy excavators and trucks were gone, leaving only deep, muddy ruts in the gravel path. I took my old, woven basket from the porch and walked into the orchard. I strolled between the rows of ancient trees, breathing in the crisp autumn air. I gathered several large, red-streaked Gravenstein apples, their skins smooth and cold against my fingers. The orchard was safe, its trees destined to stand for generations to come, their roots anchored deep in our soil. The setting sun painted the orchard in warm, golden hues of amber and gold. I sat on our old wooden bench beneath Thomas's favorite tree, the basket of apples resting beside me. I pulled his silver pocket watch from my pocket, cradling it in my hands. I held it against my chest, listening to its steady, rhythmic tick, a heartbeat which merged with the rustling of the leaves in the wind. A deep, cleansing peace filled my soul. I stared at the horizon, watching the golden light fade over the Oregon hills. The roots of this orchard run deep into the dark earth, but the branches always reach toward the clear, unyielding truth.